This is part 2 of the restoration of my HZ 1-tonner's steering column. In part 1, I pulled it all apart and stripped off all the rust. In part 2, it got new bearings and new paint, and it is all back together again, but not before I had to solve 4 small challenges along the way. I had already cleaned the metal parts with oil grease and wax remover so that they were ready to treat with the Kill Rust. Well, the painting of the steering column is finished and I am really happy with how it turned out. Let me show you. So the bits I did was the outer steering column, the inner steering shaft. I also did the lock cylinder housing, and I did this plastic piece as well. I did not do that plastic cover which goes over the crumple zone of the steering column because it is a soft black plastic. It's already in pretty good condition, and I wasn't sure that I could get paint to stick to that anyway because it has to get stretched out to go around that crumple zone anyway. But the first step with Kill Rust is the Rust Eater, and that converts any of the leftover rust that's on the metal of the column and the shaft. What I did was 2 to 3 coats, I can't remember exactly how many on each piece, of the Kill Rust primer, and then I did 4 coats of the satin enamel. That was on the steering column outer. I couldn't really get up inside it though. I may still put some fish oiline up in there. I'm not quite decided on that yet. And the same process on the steering shaft, which is already in there, you can see. Same for the cylinder lock housing. But with the plastic piece that goes around, I can't quite remember the name of this at the moment, but it's a hard plastic, and I wasn't too sure if the Kill Rust paint would work on that because it's really designed for corroded metal. I contacted Wattle, who make Kill Rust, and they suggested using the Super Etch primer instead of the primer that I did use on the metal parts, and that seems to work pretty well. I probably did 3 coats, maybe 4 coats of the Super Etch primer, really light dusting coats so that it would kind of lay down pretty well. And then I did 4 coats of the same satin enamel that I used on the metal parts. That came up really well. I'm just so happy with that. It looks pretty much new. So now the whole thing's ready for reassembly. Before I started assembly, I just used some basic multi-purpose cleaning spray for all of the plastic parts and most of the wiring, and then just contact cleaner for the electrical contacts and the ends of the wires, and everything is in really, really good condition. I could not see any damage at all to the wires and no corrosion really on the contacts. It started out looking pretty close to new, but just a bit dusty, but it certainly came up looking almost like new, so I'm pretty happy with that. So the first part of reassembly is getting this upper bearing into the lock cylinder housing, and you can tell no pressure, it just drops straight in. So I'm thinking something else is going to be needed to hold that in there. If you saw the disassembly process video that I did of this steering column, you might recall that there was some casting around the edge here that held the original bearing in, and that broke when I pressed the old bearing out. You might be able to just make out the rough edge around there where it did break away. I know that it is possible to get the new bearing in a little bit deeper by kind of die grinding out that little lip down inside there so that the bearing sits deeper in the lock cylinder housing, and then to pin or work some of that alloy back around to hold that bearing in. That's too crafty for me. I just don't think I have the skill to do it. No doubt I would crack and break something, and I don't want to risk it. But enough people have said that just using an epoxy around the outside of that bearing, or between that bearing and the lock cylinder housing, is going to be enough to keep it fairly firm. And like once the steering shaft is through here and the spring and the circlip's back on, that should hold it in. So that's what I'm hoping for anyway. What I'm going to use to hold this bearing into the lock cylinder housing is some JB Weld, probably a fairly light smearing of it because I don't want to overdo it and end up pushing JB Weld up inside the bearing and destroying it. Let's see how that goes. I didn't use much, just a few smears inside the housing and then around the top of the outside of the new bearing. If you were more gentle than I was in pressing out the old bearing, there might still be enough of the casting left that you could peen or fold it back over the edge of the new bearing, but I destroyed it, hence the JB Weld. Installing the lower bearing and retainer on the shaft was where the first challenge came up. The new retainer, the plastic bit, seemed to be a little bit bigger in circumference than the old one, and even though I could get it inside the column just with a little bit of prying, it did stretch out the column a little bit, and that meant that the retaining clip that holds it all together, it just wouldn't line up with the screw holes. And I tried several attempts to compress the steering column more around the bearing retainer. I leveraged inside the screw hole with a punch. I tried multi-grips, a locking plier clamp to try and squeeze on the column. Nothing worked. I finally gave in and just drilled out the retainer clamp screw holes a tiny bit, just until I could get both screws in, and that was all it needed, and it's all back together and nice and tight. Now, before putting the lock cylinder housing back onto the steering shaft, I got rid of the old, well, it's not exactly a circlip, but there's a ring that sits in a groove on the steering shaft which stops the housing from sliding down the shaft. That was trial and error with a hooked pick and then some locking pliers to kind of reef it off at the end. Getting the new one on was the second challenge I had. And again, the best tools were the hooked pick, but also a lot of patience. And the third challenge came with installing the washers and spring and circlip that hold the housing and bearing onto the shaft. Compressing the spring is impossible by hand, but Scotty came up with the design of 2 bolts, a big washer, and then using the steering wheel nut on the steering shaft to sort of tighten down and use those bolts to compress the spring, at least until the circlip groove was revealed. And then, for safety more than anything, we used pliers to squeeze the circlip into the groove. And it went in quite easily. I mean, this could have gone quite wrong, but thankfully it didn't. For some bizarre reason, getting the screws aligned right to reattach the steering column to the underside of the lock cylinder housing was much harder than it should have been. Like with most of the finicky jobs with this whole HZ restoration, patience counterintuitively is the best tool that you can use to get it done in the least amount of time. The manual said to grease all the moving parts in the rack assembly, I guess, with graphite grease. Google told me that Teflon grease is a good alternative, and that's what I had, so that's what I used. The sector was very easy to slide in and position on the little rod in the lock cylinder housing. In my case, probably small fingers helped make that easy. The spring goes in easy too, and it's only just a little bit fiddly to get the lock pin and actuator rod lined up in the housing as well. Do take care though, as I've learned, to align the sector teeth with the actuator rod teeth properly. There is a big tooth on the sector that aligns really neatly with a big gap along the toothed section of the actuator, which does make it easy to see if you've got it right. It just took me a couple of goes to get it right. Now, the fourth challenge that I had was more annoying probably than difficult. The HZ manual said install the turn signal selector before installing the lock cylinder. but I'd recommend doing it the other way around, and that's learning the hard way. I had not aligned the sector correctly, which should have been with the actuating rod pulled all the way out the back of the lock cylinder housing. And so when the lock cylinder clicked into place with the spring latch, I had to remove the turn signal bits to depress the spring latch and then release the lock cylinder again to get it aligned right. So yeah, more annoying than difficult. In any case, installing the lock cylinder needs the key in the fully on position so that the spring latch can easily depress as you wiggle the lock cylinder into the little tunnel with it aligned to the keyway in there, which is pretty obvious. You just keep wiggling and check in behind the lock cylinder housing to make sure that the sector is engaging with the back of the lock cylinder. Then you'll either feel or hear or both a little click as the spring latch catches the slot in the housing. That's the same slot that I showed you in part 1 that I had to scratch away at the casting to be able to access it, to be able to even see it. Now both of the little wiring looms, I guess, feed through the gaps in the housing. The turn signal selector screws in first, and then the lever slides in and screws to the turn signal selector, which is easy enough. Because I'm not installing this into Trixie for some time yet, I didn't bother going any further, but the next step will be reinstalling the ignition switch. But yeah, right now there's no point doing that. So this is it's now going to get wrapped up in some clean rags and stored until Trixie's cab is remounted to her chassis. I'm not sure if you noticed this kind of thing, but maybe you noticed a lot of wardrobe changes in this video, and that's really because this job was spread over several weeks, just fitting it in when I could. The same is happening with stripping the rust and paint from inside Trixie's cab. I'm just doing bits when I have the time, and it seems to have been quite busy lately, hence no videos on the channel for the last couple of weeks. But it's all coming along, and I will update you on that once it's done. And starting to get exciting because I think I have settled on a cam for the 308 that I'm rebuilding for Trixie, so I'm almost ready to start buying some fun bits. I'll let you know about that too. So stay tuned. I'll catch you in the next video.